Hello everyone and welcome back to Module 5. This is video 2 and we're going to talk about the Alfar or the Alpha, which are the Elves. So the first question we've got to ask is, what are the Alpha? What are the Alpha? And the answer is, it's very complicated. The texts seem quite contradictory and scholars have a variety of theories about what they are. In the Artroth book, it says, unfortunately for those who like things nice and neat, different peoples at different times had different views on what Alf actually meant. And we're going to go through what some of those different views are. Okay. Terry Gunnell, academic and historian, says, it seems clear that the extant early Nordic sources point to a range of different understandings of Alfar, which varied over time and in accordance with the worldviews of the writers. Sometimes they seem to be their own class of being. Sometimes they cross over with other types of being. Perhaps it's a name for all supernatural beings that aren't the gods. But the boundaries between the different categories of spirit, whether it's elves, dwarves, gods, and dead, are very slippery in the lore. So it's very hard to get a fixed, this is what an elf is, this is what a dwarf is, this is what a god is. There's a lot of slippery boundaries between them all, okay? And the Alfar can also overlap with land spirits. They can overlap with the dead. They can overlap with dwarves. Or maybe these things actually become Alfar. So maybe the dead are elevated up to become an elf. And we'll see examples of that, in fact. So things are just not very nice and neat. That said, Snorri, with his Christian beliefs and ideas, and he wants to systematize everything. So he categorizes everyone into the light elves and the dark elves. But a lot of scholars will say that this is probably something he invents because it's very suspiciously similar to the Lucidarius classification of angels. Okay, and the idea of there being light elves and dark elves doesn't really fit in any other sources. It's just Snorri that talks about these. He also talks about Black Elfland, which is Svartalfheim, which seems to be where the dwarves live. So are the dark elves actually just the dwarves? He tries to systematize it, but it's still quite complicated. Okay, there's no clear answers, unfortunately. But we're going to go through the evidence and you'll be able to make up your mind on how you see these things. So let's have a look at some different factors about the elves. So firstly, they were bright and beautiful. This is something that a lot of the sources will talk about. Okay, so in the Norse, you've got the word Alf or Alfar. In Old English, it's Alpha or Ilfa, and in German, it's Alp. Okay, and they all come from the Proto-Germanic Albis or Alp, which means white or shining or white one, and from the Proto-Indo-European for bright and shining white. So the root word of Alf seems to suggest something white and shining, okay? Something bright. They were clearly considered beautiful and bright. They've got elf names like Elfbjord, which means elf bright, or Elfshine, beautiful as an elf. The sun itself is referred to as Alfredol, Alfbeam, glory of elves, and gleam of Alfheim. And Snorri tells us that light elves are more beautiful than the sun, and they live in a place called Alfheim, according to Snorri. So we've got this idea of these elves as bright and beautiful beings, okay? Now, another factor is that elves might have been exclusively male in an earlier period, because we don't really have any examples of female elves until long into the Christian period. Okay, so elf itself is grammatically masculine, okay, and Old Icelandic alpha is a masculine word as well, and seems also only associated with males. And the Old High German Alp, again, is only associated with males. There's a lack of words for female elves in any of the early texts, okay? And when alpha is used in kennings, it's for human warriors, but only for males, okay? A king might be called an alpha of attack, or a hero might be called an alpha of the ship. Okay, either way, it all seems to be masculine. But importantly, they had feminine or effeminate traits. They are called beautiful. They did Seidr. Think about the word Alfsiden in Old English, which is cognate with the Norse Seidr, which is a magic that's seen as very feminine. Okay, so they might be male, but they have feminine traits to them. And over time, in the Christian era, it seems that female elves, are becoming more prominent and dominant. So by the sort of late Middle Ages, you have most elves are seen more as female. The ruler of the elves is the queen of the elves, things like that. So it changes over time from a more masculine elf to a more feminine elf. Okay. Now, Alaric Hall, he is a scholar who works at Leeds University, and he has written a great book on elves in Anglo-Saxon England, which looks both at the Norse sources and the Old English sources and tries to explain what elves are. And so he says this, he says, elves were not invisible, sprite-like, arrow-shooting creatures. Rather, they are otherworldly, beautiful, elfshiner, effeminate, human-like beings who use magic and Seidr, like Alfsiden, and are capable of inflicting illness on people who transgress social norms. They exhibited gender-transgressing traits, like being beautiful and using Seidr. If there were female alpha, they were only minor components in the early Anglo-Saxon belief systems. And for early skaldic poets, alpha denoted something close enough to human males to be used in kennings for them, and something close enough to us, the gods, to share this usage. Okay, so they're somewhere in between. Okay, this is what a systematic study of the elves in the literature and the sources suggests. Okay, according to Alaric Hall. But there is another possibility. Okay, Armand Jacobson, he suggests something else. He says alpha could perhaps include more or less every paranormal spirit that had powers superior to humans, including sometimes the Vanir, and yet did not belong to the Old Norse pantheon. So that's the idea that you've got the gods, and then every other spirit could be considered under the title elves or Alfar. Okay, so there's two different suggestions there from scholars. So let's have a look at that Azir and Alfar idea. So the lore repeatedly uses this phrase Azir and Alfar, which is Azir och Alfar, okay, rather than Azir and Vanir, which is really surprising because the Norse, you see them as having two tribes of gods, the Azir and the Vanir, okay? But instead, it constantly uses this Azir and Alfar, okay, the gods and the elves. Lokasenna 3 times says Azir and Alfar, who are here within. You've got the Old English Wid Firstace charm, which says the Isa, which is the Azir, basically in Old English, and Alpha, which is the Alfar. So Isa and Alpha are in there. Then you've got Thrimskvida, which says, what is the trouble among Azir? What is among elves? So again, Azir and elves. You've got Havamal, which says, of Azir and elves, I know every detail. Few who are not wise know that. Again, Grimnismal, the land is sacred, which I see lie near the Azir and the Alfar. Skirnismal, among the Azir and the Alfar, no one wants us two to be together. So there seems to be also a very close association between the Vanir and the Alfar. Okay, it may be that the Vanir and the Alfar are actually the same group of beings, or that the Alfar are a subset of the Vanir, or the Vanir are a subset of the Alfar. Okay, so let's consider why this might be. So first, you've got Freyr. Now, he is a Vanir god, okay? And he's very associated with the Alfar, the elves. So he's given Alfheim, the elf home, to rule over as a Tuthi. He's linked with the mound dead, okay? The dead who live in the mounds. These are very often considered to be elves. In several texts, Yngvi and Alfar, so Yngvi is another name for Freyr, they are brothers, okay? For instance, Yngling the Saga and Helga Vida Hundingsbana both suggest that. Alfar often practice Seidr, which is, or you can look at the word Alfsiden, as I said, from Old English, which is cognate with Seidr, the Elf Seidr. And this is considered a Vanir magic. You've got Freya teaching Odin and others how to do Seidr because she's the Vanir goddess, okay, and they're not. The Alfar are also often associated with fertility, just like the Vanir gods. The Vanir gods are the fertility gods. So Freyr is sacrificed to, for instance, for a good year and peace, while Olaf Gerdstad Alfar, notice the Alfar at the end, was sacrificed to for a good year. And Alfar are honoured at harvest time in autumn, which is the Alpha blot. Okay, so they're very associated with the same things, the Vanir and the Alfar. Their gods are the same, and they're associated with each other in the texts, Azir and Alfar, constantly. So, yeah, the Alfar and the Vanir, they may be the same, but that's not the end of the story, because there's contradictions as usual. So, there are some texts that distinguish between the Vanir and the Alfar. In Skirnismal, Sigdrifamal, and Alvismal, they all talk about Vanir and Alfar as two separate groups, so it's actually not very clear-cut. It might be perhaps that some groups thought that they were Vanir and Alfar are the same, and some groups thought that there was some sort of overlap, but they're not the same, that sort of thing. Another possibility is that the saying Azir and Alfar just seems to denote all holy beings, and that the Alfar just refers to all the supernatural beings that weren't the Azir gods. Just like we said, one of the academics there, he said, actually, they're just probably all the other non-god supernatural beings. Okay, so that's another possibility. If we look at some of the Irish sources, the earliest Irish sources, they have this saying, De ocus ande, okay, which means gods and ungods, i.e. spirits, so gods and spirits. So it's the same, possibly the same sort of thing with Azir and Alfar, gods and spirits. It may be the same thing, okay, going on in both cultures. Another thing that the Alpha are associated with is the dead, okay? In fact, there's a very strong association between them. I think if they are the dead, okay, then they're a special class of the dead, the sort of the noble dead, okay? The ones that are really good or heroic dead who then have some sort of way been elevated after death, okay? Because Alf in German comes from the Albas, that we said, which means about shining ones, but also can mean noble ones. Okay. And a lot of noble people in society had Elf in their name. If you think about King Alfred, okay, Alf in his name. And kings like Olaf Gerdstad, who become elves. So he's a king who dies in a, well, he has lots of fertility in the land, but he dies in a famine or plague, I think. And then he tells people not to worship him after his death, but they do anyway. And then they called him Olaf Gerdstad Alfar, so Olaf the Elf of Gerdstad. Okay, so kings often will become elves as well. So this suggests it's sort of noble people that become elves. Claude Lecoultre, he writes that those who are elevated to the status of elves, therefore minor divinities, are those dead whose lives were particularly exemplary or beneficial for their contemporaries. Okay, so here we're seeing them almost like their ancestors who have been elevated, okay, almost into minor divinities, minor gods. Turville Petra, he says, elves dwelling in mounds had come to be identified with the dead. In this case, they may be male counterparts of the Disir. So Turville Petra has this theory that the Alfar are the male ancestors and the Disir are the female ancestors. I think he goes too far in suggesting that, as I said in the other video about the Disir. But the elves here are sort of the male noble dead in this case. Dr. Scott Shell, he's a Germanic philologist, and he argues again that they should be seen as honorable or heroic ancestors or noble male ancestors. Okay, so they're not just all the dead; they're a specific class, special class of the noble dead. Okay. in our Troth Volume 2, it says, in both Old Norse sources and Scandinavian folklore, the dead are sometimes called Alfar, especially those dead that dwell in their mounds. Okay, so we've got this association again with the mounds, with the dead. So the Alfar, they could be a set of noble dead. Okay. In Landnámabók, you've got some Icelanders who believe that they would die into the hills. So it's not just the mounds. Mounds are almost like a mini hill, a mini hill basically. And so you could actually die into the mountains or into the hills. There's an Irish word, Alcail, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, I'm afraid, which means ghost of the dead. And that is from the Old Norse word Alfkarl or Elfman. So again, associating the elves with the dead. The dwarf Dane, he teaches runes to elves, and his name means the dead one. Okay, so he's a dwarf, but he's called the dead one, and he's teaching runes to elves. And then if we look at the Wild Hunt, which is a procession that goes through the skies in the winter in a lot of Northern European countries, it's a procession of elves often, and it's a procession of the dead. So again, it's linking these two together. So the Alfar and the dead are very, very closely linked in the sources. Then you've got these dark or mound Alfar, which again is very similar to the dead, okay? And they're probably the same beings. So these are Alfar who live in the mound or in the earth. They are the dead in the mounds, okay? And worship of the dead in the mounds goes back to the Stone Age, okay? It's a cult of elf worship that's one of the oldest strands of heathenry, okay? But it doesn't go on so much in modern times. Like I said, a lot of it's more focused on the gods, but actually things like the ancestors and the elves are, and the Disir, and are really, it's much clearer in the sources that those were some of the oldest types of worship. So the mounds are often in places where they can overlook the land, okay? So they're designed so that the ancestors or the dead whoever's in the mounds can actually look down over their descendants and watch over them. And so the dead can become like this tutelary spirit of place. As I said, kings can be referred to as elves, but great men are often referred to as an elf in the text. So again, this is a suggestion of this noble dead type idea. They often bring fertility to the land. So the elves are associated, the dark elves or mound elves are associated with bringing fertility to the land. There are kings whose reign was one of peace and fertility, and they're the ones that often get placed in mounds and worshipped. They get sacrificed to after death, basically in the hope that they continue to bless the land with fertility. I talked about Olaf Gerdstaf Alfar. He brought fertility to the land, dies, and then is worshipped because, or his rule was associated with a time of peace, prosperity, fertility, etc. And then he dies in this plague, and then he is worshipped afterwards in the hope that he will, from the other world, will be able to grant fertility to the people. You also got Freyr in Ynglinga Saga. So Snorri in Ynglinga Saga says basically the Freyr is this human king who dies, and he gets put into this mound, and then during his rule, again, it was a time of peace, prosperity, and fertility. And so the people don't get told that he's dead. They just said he's living in this mound. And so people go and put gold and silver and stuff as offerings in for him. And so again, he is seen as a mound elf in some ways. Okay. He also becomes like the lord of the mound elves, and he's associated with the mound elves as well. Halfdan Havaitbein, he's called the elf with the breastplate. So this is another important person in heathen lore, and he's called an elf. Okay. In Cormac's saga, the elves live in a hill. Again, this is like a mound, Okay, so maybe it was a mound actually, but it says a hill. And they're sacrificed to for healing. So this is something else the elves can do, is they can bring healing to you. Okay. There is a field of burial mounds in Hardanger in Norway, and this is called Alvarval, which is the field of Alfar. So again, these burial mounds are being associated with the Alfar. It really does suggest that the dead and the Alfar are somehow very, very related to each other. And consequently, the Vanir is sort of all in one. They seem to be associated with each other. And then in modern Iceland, elves are often believed to inhabit certain rocks. So the rocks are more like the mountain rather than the hill, but they're roughly the same sort of thing, aren't they? Mountains, hills, big rocks, grave mounds, etc. They're all very similar, these big, tall things in the landscape. Okay, and elves are believed to inhabit them in the modern times. So what are the Alfar? That is the question for you. Okay. Are they the Vanir? Are they a subset of the Vanir? Are the Vanir a subset of them? Are they the dead? Are they the noble dead? There's lots of ideas here. Okay. Are they just completely different species? Are they every supernatural being that's not a god? Unfortunately, the texts are not 100% clear. Okay. From my perspective, I think that they are the same as the Vanir, in my view, and they are also the noble dead. Okay, they are a class of elevated dead that not necessarily human dead. I mean, they could be dead of any of the species, but they are elevated dead, basically, which are then also the same thing, essentially, as the Vanir. Okay. So are the Alpha and Alpha good or are they bad? Okay. So the earliest evidence suggests that they were seen as good and beneficial, but in later texts, especially once Christianity comes into the picture, they're often demonized. So what are the good things, or why might we consider them good? So the word Alf is often used in personal names. For instance, you've got Elfbert, which means elf bright, Elf Gifu, elf gift, Alfred, elf advice, Albofledis, elf beauty, Albion, elf friend, Alfswinder, elf strong. Okay, and these names, they are names of people. Okay, and they're just after Christianization is taken over. Okay, so elves at this point are probably being seen almost close to an angel. Okay, and beneficent to people. They're not really bad beings. They're more beneficial. I mean, people. Why would people be named after elves if elves are seen as just some horrible bad thing? Okay. Instead, people's names, including very important people's names, are using the word elf in it. Okay. So elves can't have been seen as bad at that point. In fact, Neil Stun argues that names were coined at a time when elves were regarded as friendly creatures. Okay. In Skaldic poetry, being named after the Alfar is seen as a good thing. You've got great men like Olaf Gerstad Alfar, as well as warriors who are being named after elves. In Iceland, elves are called Ljuflingar, or dear friends, and they often seem to be beneficent and willing to help humans. So there's a positive, good nature to the elves, particularly in the earliest sources. Okay. However, they are not always seen as good. Okay, and that's important to note. They're just like any human. Humans can be good, humans can be bad. They'll be both, basically. The ability to do both. But they seem to be more demonized as we get later into the periods. So elves, they seem to have been demonized over time. If you look at Beowulf, if you look at Germany, if you look at the things like the Widderstich charm, all of them start to suggest the elves as negative things, okay, that are able to cause illnesses. And they cause this illness through something called elf shot. Now, The symptoms of elf shot can be sharp pains, arthritis, wasting sickness, bone cancer, nightmare, fevers, delusions, all those sorts of things can be seen as an example of elf shot. Okay, and you can see in the top right there a picture of the prehistoric arrowheads. Okay, these little bits of flint, and these were seen as evidence of elf shot. So if you found one, it was evidence that where the elves had shot someone. Okay. Now, often the elves seem to be associated with the mental side of things. So the mind, controlling the mind, changing the mind, causing delusions, nightmares, and things like that. Okay. They do this magic called Elfseden, which we've talked about being cognate to say there. Okay. This is something that is said to affect the mind in a lot of the old medical books. In fact, the word elfig, which is like elfie from Old English, it means insane or frantic. In Germany, they cause nightmares. There's something called Albtraum, Elfdream, or Albdruck, elf oppression. Okay, so it's all this sort of magical ability to affect the mind is what the elves seem to be associated with. They may steal children and leave changelings behind. So they take the real children and leave a version of their own behind. Okay. The Helliand suggests that elves play tricks on people. Now, this is obviously a Christian version of the gospel, but it's written in a way to appeal to the Germanic heathens. So there's a lot of Germanic words, concepts, and things within the Helliand, which helps us to see how the worldview. But this is, again, it is a Christian thing. So they're suggesting elves playing tricks on people here. So they can be seen as bad, and they were demonized over time. However, we probably should be clear that even in earlier times, when they're seen more as positive and good, they probably had a magical ability to cause illness if people displeased them. Okay, so if you got on the wrong side, these are supernatural beings. They are not like your bank in the sky that you can go and ask for whatever you want, and they always have your best interest at heart. No, they're not that. Okay, they are beings with their own agendas, their own ideas, their own desires, and if you annoy them, just like if you annoy any human, they're likely to react negatively towards you. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so how can we honor the Alfar or the Alpha? So whether you're dealing with elves or when we look at land spirits, it's the same. Good manners is key. Okay, so always treat them with respect and good manners. It's a good idea to accept their gifts. In some of the folk tales we have, they give things that look useless, but then actually turn into gold. So just because it looks rubbish doesn't mean you should just reject it. Okay, so think about accepting their gifts. If you know they dwell in a specific place, a particular stone, a particular mound, if there's a burial mound in your area, or some particularly large special stone, especially if it's like a prehistoric one, be quite respectful of that because they probably dwell in that. If you have to destroy their home, tell them and give them time to move out. Okay, there's an example of roads being built through Iceland, but it was believed that there were some elves living in this rock that they wanted to move. So they got I think it was a Sather worker in to go into trance and talk to the elves and explain what was going to happen. And then they gave the elves time to move out so that then they could move the rock and build the road. Never relieve yourself near them. Okay, the Norse expressions for relieving oneself, like Alfric Ganga and Alfric Hava, which mean to drive out the elves. So it's very clear they do not like that. Okay. Celebrate Alpha Blot. Okay, this is a sacrifice to the elves around the harvest time. So do a sacrifice to the elves. It's normally done in a home, but you could do it at a place you know the elves dwell, and give them a sacrifice for the harvest, maybe, or just as more of a sort of an ancestral to honor them as noble ancestors. If you want healing, you could take the example of Cormac's saga and sacrifice to the elves at a place where you know they dwell and ask for healing. Okay, there's basically a guy is ill, and he asks a magical worker what to do, and she says, go to this hill where the elves are, sacrifice this bull, and essentially feed them with the blood, or this cow, feed them with the blood that as a sacrifice, and then you'll be well. And that's what he does. You can honor them at Yule, because they're often said to visit human homes then. There's in fact an Icelandic custom of bidding the elves to home, which means you do it at Yule and you bid them to come into your home around the Yule period. Okay, so they can bring their blessings and their magic and things. On Midsummer's Eve, it's said that if you sit under an elder tree, you might see the king of Elfland in Danish folklore. Okay, so elder trees are associated with them, and you can potentially do that on Midsummer's Eve. There's an example in 19th century Norway of a farmer being died, and then they slaughter a cow for the mound dweller. So they see him as a mound dweller, okay? Or they see him as being associated in some way anyway with the mound. We often find these Bronze Age holy stones marked with small round depressions. So we saw a picture of this when we were looking at building altars indoors and outdoors. Okay, and it's the Alf cups, the Alf mills, where you've got the stone rock with lots of little small round depressions in them, and you can pour offerings into them like milk and stuff. We know that was done in folklore. You can visit these mounds and give offerings, and good offerings can include things like milk, beer, blood, butter, silver. Those are sort of things that we can see in the folklore that was given to them. They also seem to like music. Okay, they dance at elf rings. So you might have heard about when you see mushrooms in a circle. That's an elf ring, and it's said that they dance in those. So music seems to be something that they really like. Okay, you can honor them with, maybe you could write some poetry or music for them. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this module. We've got some homework for you to do. Okay, so firstly, I want you to think about how you view the Modron Disir and the Alfar. Okay, so maybe rewatch these videos again, go through the different ideas, think about how they fit for you. Okay, and then write a paragraph in your journal about each one. Next, I want you to perform a small ritual honoring the mothers or the Disir. So the mothers if you're Anglo-Saxon or continental, the Disir if you're Norse pagan, and add this to your regular monthly rituals on the first crescent moon. Okay, and I suggest you give them an offering of fruit. Okay, as your specific offering for the mothers or the Disir. Okay, so that's on the first crescent moon of each month. I also suggest that you also do a special ritual for Disiblat on either winter nights, or for Mother's Night at the winter solstice, or on the 24th of December. So choose one of those dates and do a special ritual to the mothers or the Disir on that time. And maybe look back at what we said about putting out the knives, the 3 knives, and setting out a special table and a special drink and stuff for them on that night. And you can use that as inspiration for your ritual. And also start honoring the elves or the Alfar. Okay, perhaps you could do an Alpha Blot ritual, which again is an autumn one, maybe around winter nights or the month after or something. And then there's a bit of reading to do here. Okay, so there's some links for you to click on and have a read of, and that will give you some different ideas about how you can see the Azir and the Alpha and the mothers, the matronae. Okay. And then if you want to go further, there's also various recommended readings. So we've got the books, like I've mentioned, Pagan Goddesses in Early Germanic World. That's the Philip Shaw one. You've got Elves in Anglo-Saxon England by Alaric Hall, History of Elves and Dwarves by Claude Lecoulter, and so on. Okay, and we've got links to some of these things there as well. So have a read of these things and then try and work out for yourself, well, how do you view the elves and the mothers or the Disir? Okay. And that is it for this module. So we will see you next in module 6, where we're going to talk about the land spirits.